Hello, my name is Dr. Richard Lakeman. Today's lecture is going to address the meaning of mental illness and how our current conceptions of mental illness might contribute to stigma and marginalisation of people so diagnosed. Our objectives for today are to identify historical and contemporary conceptions of madness, to describe the medico-psychological concept of mental disorder, how it's identified and categorised using diagnostic and statistical manuals, and then to very briefly consider the concepts of stigma and discrimination as applied to mental illness, and to identify how medical conceptions of mental illness might contribute to stigma and discrimination. To begin, I'd like you to briefly write down your definition of health and a few things that you actively do to maintain your health. We all have some idea of what it means to be healthy, and very different ways of accounting for health and illness. For millennia, and across cultures, there was no clear demarcation between mental health, and indeed mental illness, and other aspects of health, physical, spiritual, social, and so forth. Health in most traditions and cultures involved the balance of various forces. In the European tradition, health was thought to be a function of the interaction between the environment, body, and personality. For example, fire, earth, air and water, heat, cold, dry and damp, or internal body humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, or personality types or temperament, such as sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric and melancholic. Illness was thought to occur when there was an imbalance of some kind within each of these systems or between them. To this day, when people state they're out of kilter or out of whack, they are appealing to a very ancient idea. Even the more contemporary, if overly simplistic and often erroneous idea that people who are mentally ill have a chemical imbalance, appeals to a long-standing Western discourse about health. Many people still consider balance as central or axiomatic of health, and the more modern notion of homeostasis reflects this. Before the term was coined, the French philosopher René Descartes had an extraordinary influence on Western thinking about health and illness, and set the scene for the modern scientific approach to medicine. Descartes coined the famous maxim, cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. The proof of our existence is that we doubt it. For our purposes of considering the meaning of mental health and illness, Descartes created a neat distinction between the mind and the body, known today as Cartesian dualism. The body he proposed is like a machine and follows the laws of nature. The mind is something separate, non-material, and it doesn't follow the laws of nature, but interacts with the body through the pineal gland. Well, he did get that bit wrong, but the idea that the body is much like a machine and that the mind is something separate persists to this day and influences the way we explore and account for mental health, brain science, and so on. Without making this distinction, we wouldn't even be talking about mental health or illness. Indeed, nobody did until fairly recently. We continue to carve up health into constituent parts. Indeed, health and welfare systems are often geared to deal with different aspects of health. For example, health professionals such as physicians, surgeons, nurses and physios deal with the physical aspects of health. Psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists and psychiatric nurses deal with mental illness. Social workers, family services, counsellors and OTs deal with the social and occupational elements of health. Arguably, spirituality is a much neglected element of health, but philosophy and religion provide a range of wise women and men, rites and ritual, and law to assist with the spiritual dimensions of health. Many people argue that they practice holistically, meaning that when promoting health or addressing illness, they attend to salient biopsychosocial spiritual issues. The extent to which this is actually true is often debatable. However, that people invest considerable money and time engaging with alternative or complementary approaches to health rather than biomedical ones suggests that for many people the simple divisions of health into constituent parts is unsatisfactory. Even the biopsychosocial spiritual paradigm is in itself a rather simple reduction. Today, for example, we talk about the health of the planet, healthy homes, healthy communities, and so forth. In traditional cultures and societies which have very different worldviews and which emphasize collectivism rather than individualism, conceptions of health can be markedly different and complex. Here is an example by Rose Perry, a New Zealand Maori woman, who uses the metaphor of te wheke, or the octopus, and its 8 tentacles that collectively contribute to order or total well-being. One's well-being may be affected by any of these elements, and indeed an imbalance or problem in any area may impact on another. For collectivist societies and cultures, conceptions of health cannot be separated from the well-being or health of the wider group, be it family, extended family, kinship group, community, tribe, or country. What use is personal health anyway unless it contributes to the greater good? And how can one be said to be healthy when one's family clearly isn't? Understanding health requires understanding of a particular culture, and our understandings of health, whether we recognize them or not, are underpinned by our own cultural and cultural values. The World Health Organization has long recognized that health is more than not having a disease, and that it is a means to an end, a resource for everyday life. However, because health is embedded in cultural ideas, this definition may in itself be restrictive and clearly omits some cultural understandings. Definitions of health, of course, vary according to understandings about the nature of factors which pose a threat to health. Shifts in our understanding have been associated with shifts in the way health and welfare services have been orientated. The sanitation movement of the 19th and early 20th century saw the cleaning up of the slums and the provision of clean water and waste removal in much of Western Europe and North America. This arose from an understanding that aspects of the physical environment impacted on health. The earliest explanations for communicable disease associated with poor sanitation were what we call miasmatic, or due to miasma or bad air. Later socio-cultural understandings led to attempts at social engineering and the development of the sub-discipline of social psychiatry. The discovery of germs led to what is sometimes known as the golden age of preventative medicine. Whilst we might acknowledge that health is a result of complex systemic interactions among social, cultural and biological factors, our approach to health problems, particularly mental health problems, has traditionally been founded on other understandings. So what of mental health? We can thank René Descartes for setting the scene for mental health to be considered as something separate from health in general. This was escalated last century with the ascendancy of psychiatry as a distinctive discipline. This was an astounding socio-political piece of manoeuvring, as psychiatry was founded at a time when there were no medical explanations or effective treatments for madness. As an aside, the one big success was the observation in the mid-19th century, and later confirmation in 1917, that untreated syphilis led to general paresis of the insane. Until this discovery, or the discovery of penicillin, a large percentage of people in asylums had this degenerating and ultimately fatal condition. However, this is the only mental illness that has been conclusively demonstrated to have a biological basis. So to mental health. The World Health Organization defines mental health thus, in terms of capabilities, coping, functioning, and potential contribution. They also make the point that one really can't speak about health without incorporating mental health. It does raise some vexatious questions about what constitutes normal stress. Many people that might manifestly demonstrate what we might consider signs of mental ill health have been exposed to horrendous stressors and abusive relationships. Others, such as people who are homeless, are exposed on an ongoing basis to extremes of stress and may indeed manifest what in other contexts might be seen to be symptoms, simply as a means of coping. Mental health is an exceptionally broad concept. Some of the most popular books in the world and the largest sections of bookshops promote self-development, self-improvement and self-help, all drawing heavily on positive psychology. Positive mental health encompasses emotional intelligence or regulation, assertive communication, contentment and happiness, wholesome relationships, mental flexibility, and growth. In the associated tutorial, we'll encourage you to complete a positive mental health questionnaire. The kind of positive mental health promoted on the shelves of a bookshop near you are generally what Maslow might consider, or might have described, as higher level needs. This, I suspect, many of you will be familiar with. A simple but elegant way of thinking about what needs to be done, or the building blocks necessary to realize mental health. It stands to reason that one needs to first address issues such as hunger, thirst, adequate sleep, and physiological balance before one can focus on higher level attainment. One needs to feel safe and secure and free from the risk of violation. One may then begin to enjoy friendship, family, love, and sexual intimacy, all precursors to self-esteem. It stands to reason that it would be rather fruitless focusing on higher level needs when lower level needs remain unmet. Our health, be it physical, mental, or social, depends on the realization of some fairly basic needs. In public health, one talks about determinants of health. How healthy we are likely to be is to a large part determined by several rolls of the dice. Where we live, our country, community, and home. Being born in and growing up in Australia, of course, confers considerable advantages compared to those who may be raised in developing countries. Where we are born will determine to a large extent what opportunities are available to us. Our living conditions, the availability of education, healthcare, good nutrition, and sanitation. This shapes whom we are and what we do. We know that in relation to mental health, the most formative time of development is young and emerging adulthood. Inevitably, conditions in early childhood set the scene for positive mental health in later life. It is in young adulthood in Australia that what we might consider mental illness typically emerges, and if not adequately addressed, it can become chronic. If one manages to get to 25 to 30 relatively unscathed, or having dealt with mental health problems as they emerged, then it is unlikely that mental health problems will emerge in later life, and people more or less cope with the inevitable stresses, strains, and crises of life. Promoting positive mental health of young people has become a core policy platform in Australia in recent years, and this ought to pay dividends in later years by reducing the burden of disability associated with mental health problems across all age groups. We know quite specifically what counts as protective factors or determinants of positive mental health, although this is by no means an exhaustive list. And we also know what factors might predispose the development of a constellation of mental health problems in later life. So with a largely healthy population, health promotion emphasizes building resilience and positive mental health, encouraging young people to communicate their needs, reinforcing positive parenting practices, and so forth. In many places, principles of positive psychology and mental health are taught in schools. Where populations are known to be at risk, health promotion efforts address modifiable risk factors, for example bullying, reducing harms associated with drug use, and encouraging people to talk with each other. For those who have manifest signs of ill health, and remember this is some 30% of young women below the age of 25 and 25% of young men, the emphasis needs to be getting people the kind of help they need quickly so as to reduce the potential impact on their life course. Lastly, when people have a disorder with associated disability, then the emphasis needs to be on optimal care or management, whether that be in primary care or hospital settings. So now let us consider this group, those that might be considered to have mental illness or mental ill health. When you think of mental illness or madness, what comes to mind? Mental health sounds like quite a positive concept. Madness or mental illness doesn't have quite the positive connotations. Do you think illness is the opposite of health? Do you think mental illness is just like any other kind of illness? Do you think mad people are out of control or dangerous? If mental health is a rather slippery concept, then mental illness or disorder is even more so. There is no clear boundaries between most mental health problems. There is no clear-cut distinction between, say, schizoaffective disorder and bipolar disorder. There is also no clear boundary between illness and health. Every symptom of mental illness can occur in otherwise healthy individuals. Lots of concepts have been drawn upon to define illness. The amount of distress experienced, lack of control, disability or disadvantage, cognitive flexibility, irrationality, presumed etiology, and deviation from statistical norms. None of these is equivalent to illness or disorder in themselves. There are also rarely clear boundaries between biological, psychological, or social problems. Indeed, the whole of psychiatry and psychology has been fraught with disagreements about what counts as illness, or what the cardinal symptoms are of illness. A solution has been the development of diagnostic manuals. Mental health professionals use either the International Classification of Diseases from the World Health Organization or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, now up to DSM-4 TR, to classify disorder or mental illness. This has at least enabled some degree of standardization for the purposes of research and has aided communication between health professionals. If I diagnose someone with major depression, we know what symptoms the person manifests with. What we don't know is why they're depressed, but we do have a shared understanding of the descriptive phenomenology. In the US and Australia, where medical practitioners and others are reimbursed for specific services for people with specific diagnoses, the diagnostic manuals have become increasingly important. To maintain certain welfare benefits in the US, people must have particular diagnoses. And in Australia, to receive PBS subsidies for certain drugs, one must have particular diagnoses, whether valid or not. These fiscal forces have greatly influenced the development of the diagnostic manuals. We shall return to the DSM definition shortly and provide an example, but first let's consider what is meant by disorder. There are few, if any, mental diseases in psychiatry. Where a biological etiology is clearly identified and located in the brain, it then becomes a neurological problem. For example, Parkinson's disease. It becomes a neurological condition rather than a psychiatric condition. People with Parkinson's disease, especially those being treated with dopaminergic drugs, may have psychiatric symptoms, such as delusions, hallucinations, and so forth, but they don't have a psychiatric disease per se. So they may have symptoms, which is one of the lowest level definitions of phenomena. So symptoms an observable behaviour or state. It's the simplest level of analysis, and we don't presume an etiology in relation to symptoms. For all the authoritative statements that you'll hear about schizophrenia or bipolar disorder being brain diseases, and they might well be, there have been no structural functional brain changes in people so diagnosed that have been clearly demonstrated to differentiate between the diagnosed and the broader population. So psychiatry and mental health services largely deal with people that have syndromes. A disorder, a syndrome is a constellation of symptoms that occur together or co-vary over time. And again, there is no presumed etiology to a syndrome. And if you were to read the preamble to the DSM-4, or indeed the DSM-3, you'll find they make this clear, that none of the syndromes or disorders in the DSM-4 are presumed to have a particular etiology. Although disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder clearly are related to the exposure to particular traumatic events. A disorder then is a syndrome that's not accounted for by a more encompassing condition. There may be a hypothesized etiology to a disorder, but it's still at the level of a hypothesis, whereas a disease is a disorder where the underlying etiology is known, and it's the highest level of conceptual understanding. Currently we presume biological causes, but this hasn't always been so. I'd like to show you some symptoms from a textbook from 1885. What symptoms do you discern from this esteemed text circa 1885? We have anhedonia, or lack of enjoyment of otherwise pleasurable activity, headache, motor restlessness, insomnia, non-specific pain, and a variety of somatic symptoms, pale, clammy skin, difficulties with digestion, etc. These are the symptoms. What could it be? This could be a syndrome, as these symptoms appear to go together, and there is even a presumption of a degenerating course if we rule out other conditions, perhaps depression, an infectious disease, the aforementioned syphilis. Then it might be considered a disorder. Indeed, Stout's thoroughly reliable guide to the detection and treatment of all diseases that can be either checked in their career or treated entirely by an intelligent person without the aid of a physician raises onanism to the status of a disease with known etiology. Unfortunately, this is one serious disease, the treatment of which ought to be undertaken by a skillful physician. Now this might sound like some kind of antiquated mistake, but masturbation was considered the source of much that ails us well into the 20th century. Thomas Saz, the most famed critic of the concept of mental illness, suggests that masturbation is the ideal mental illness. I'm going to quote him in full. First, it is a form of behaviour that is something people do, not something that happens to them. Second, it is a form of behaviour universal to mankind, engaged in from early childhood. This makes it ideally treatable, since behaviours can be controlled, especially in children who are powerless to resist the well-intentioned brutality of adults. Third, the act makes use of the sexual organ, ideally suited for attaching fantasies of great harm as well as great pleasure to its uses and abuses. Not surprisingly, masturbation is a disease of modernity. In antiquity and the Dark Ages, people worried about real diseases such as the plague and consumption. Only after the Enlightenment did people awaken to the possibilities of scientific medicine, assigning material rather than spiritual causes to diseases, disability, and death. Not having the faintest idea what caused most diseases, the medical mind went in search of a scapegoat and found it in self-abuse. By the end of the 1700s, it was medical dogma that masturbation caused blindness, epilepsy, gonorrhea, priapism, constipation, conjunctivitis, acne, painful menstruation, nymphomania, impotence, consumption, anemia, and of course insanity, melancholia, and suicide. None of psychiatry's classic mistakes, from masturbatory insanity and its cures with castration and clitoridectomy, to the disease of homosexuality and its compulsory treatment with aversion therapy, and to the attribution of the cause of schizophrenia to reverberating circuits in the frontal lobes and its cure with lobotomy, rewarded with a Nobel Prize in medicine, are innocent errors. Invariably the false belief in the medical interventions it appears to justify serves the needs of the believers, especially the relatives of patients who seek control over the misbehaviour of their loved ones, and the physicians who gain prestige and power by diagnosing and treating behaviour as if it was the disease. We fool ourselves if we believe that psychiatry's current popular delusions, such as the chemical causes and cures of depression, schizophrenia, suicide and so forth, do not fit the same mould. Thomas Saz has made some compelling arguments over the last 40 years. Saz, himself a professor of psychiatry, accepts that there are aspects of life which are distressing, but he argues that these problems of living are not illnesses or diseases, and therefore one cannot talk about treating them. And it perpetrates a grievous injustice to forcibly treat people based on a mythology. Many disagree with Saz, but still have reservations about the extent to which everyday problems of life have become medicalised. Both sets of diagnostic manuals have grown in size over the 20th century. Until then, what we now call mental illness was generally just categorized as idiocy or lunacy. The American Psychiatric Association attempted to standardize the nomenclature in the early part of the 20th century, differentiating between problems of mood, neuroses, and psychosis. It wasn't until 1949 that the first edition of the DSM was published and included 106 mental disorders. In 1968, DSM-2 included 182 disorders. The DSM-3 was published in 1980 and listed 265 diagnoses and ran to 495 categories. Crucially, and unlike other health problems, it introduced what we called multi-axial diagnoses. It was also widely criticised for subsuming 20 to 30% of the population who previously would not have been thought to have mental health problems. Here's an example of a multi-axial assessment form. Such an approach encourages thoroughness and evaluation, integrates all aspects of the assessment into a useful formulation. But we'll talk about that on another occasion. The DSM-4 conceptualized mental disorder as a clinically significant behavioral or psychological syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual and that is associated with present distress, for example painful symptoms, or disability, that's impairment in some areas of functioning, or with a significantly increased risk of suffering, death, pain or disability, or an important loss of freedom. In addition, the syndrome or pattern must not be merely an expectable and culturally sanctioned response to a particular event, for example the death of a loved one. Currently, the DSM divides these patterns or syndromes into categories or types rather than dimensions. The new edition is likely to have greater emphasis on dimensions, particularly when it comes to personality traits and disorders. The common disorders or categories of disorder that we'll be looking at will be the mood disorders, anxiety disorders and psychotic disorders. Even if people meet the criteria for disorder, only a small proportion are likely to experience severe and disabling symptoms. Many people may meet criteria for a substance use disorder, for example, but only a small proportion might be considered to have a severe substance use disorder. Some disorders might also be considered to be quite uncommon or be low prevalence, and others very high prevalence. This graph summarizes epidemiological studies from European countries using ICD diagnostic criteria. Each triangle represents a different study, and as you can see there is quite a lot of variation across studies. The line represents the median 12-month prevalence. Those where the median is below 1% might be considered low prevalence problems, and the remainder as high prevalence. Alcohol dependence, various anxiety disorders and depression might be considered high prevalence disorders, with some studies finding over 10% of the population meeting criteria over a 12-month period. These high prevalence conditions are often encountered in primary health care, and only the most severe forms are the focus of specialist services. The low prevalence problems, psychotic disorders, eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, dependence on illicit drugs, tend to be the focus of specialist services. We're just going to take one of these disorders, a high prevalence problem, depression, and look very briefly at the DSM criteria. So when we talk about major depression, we're talking about somebody that has 5 or more of the following symptoms which have been present during the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. At least one of those symptoms is either depressed mood or that word I mentioned before, anhedonia, or loss of interest or pleasure. So one must have 5 or more of these following symptoms: depressed mood most of the day, every day, diminished interest or pleasure, significant weight loss or weight gain, insomnia or hypersomnia, fatigue, agitation or psychomotor retardation, feelings of worthlessness, diminished ability to think or concentrate, recurrent thoughts of death. Not only that, but the symptoms don't meet criteria for a mixed episode. So this is where there are symptoms that are associated with both depression and mania, and also, and this is common with most of the disorders, they cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational or other important areas of functioning. And we rule out various physiological effects, say of substances or of general medical conditions such as hypothyroidism. So these are some of the exclusion criteria that ensure that it's not part of a more encompassing condition or a different condition. People might still have the symptoms of depression associated with other conditions, but they wouldn't be said to have major depression. So what is this thing called depression? The DSM tells us what criteria need to be met to be diagnosed, but it can't actually tell us why a person might be depressed, which could be for any number of reasons. A multi-axial diagnosis can help to suggest some possible reasons. So a multi-axial DSM diagnosis might look something like this. If you remember, axis 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So axis 1, major depression of 2 months duration with marked suicidal thoughts. Axis 2, some dependent personality traits. Axis 3, associated or possibly implicated medical problems. There's a BMI of 30, so the person's overweight, and the person also has been diagnosed with hypertension and might well be treated with antihypertensive drugs, which can exacerbate depression. Axis 4 looks at any sort of social problems or issues that the person might have. And in this case, the person was made redundant 3 months ago and separated from his long-standing girlfriend of 10 years at the same time. Quite significant life stresses. And finally, we would give an evaluation of his general functioning. So this is a scale from 1 to 100, global assessment of functioning, and his global assessment of functioning over the last few days to a week was 65. So, when we as health professionals talk about mental illness or disorder, we are doing so alluding to a set of criteria in a diagnostic manual as applied to an individual. When we read about research in relation to treating a mental illness, we can expect that the criteria for illness refer to one of the diagnostic manuals and that an estimation of the severity of the problems are made. Generally, all of these mental disorders as defined by these manuals impact on the way people feel, think, perceive and behave. Over the course of your studies, you will consider how in more depth. It ought to be apparent that the concept of mental illness or disorder is a relatively recent one. That isn't to say that extremes of behaviour or extraordinary behaviour has not been recognised for millennia. It just hasn't always been considered as abnormal or attributed to medical causes. So what has been the impact of these changing attributions? Now that we talk about people being ill, having medical problems rather than being morally corrupt or tainted, has our attitude and behaviour towards people improved? After all, people can't be held morally responsible for being ill, and we've been reassured that there are better, more effective treatments for mental illness than at any time in history. So does being identified as mentally ill continue to carry stigma, a mark of shame? In previous eras, those diagnosed with serious mental illness were separated from the wider population in asylums and often large rural hospitals. People were out of sight, if not entirely out of mind. For example, the term up the line to Goodna referred to someone losing their mind and going the 20 kilometres or so up the river to Goodna Hospital, now the Park, near Ipswich. Mental illness was something that was just not talked about, although a great many of the 50,000 people that went to Goodna did leave and return to their homes and resumed productive community living, one must presume. However, I suggest that this separation of the presumed insane from the sane contributed greatly to the stigma of diagnosis and help seeking that persists to this day. Of course, fear of being labelled as mad or being locked up was probably exacerbated by sensationalist movies, unchecked news reporting that associates madness with a lack of control and dangerous, dangerousness. Fear was also sometimes justified by the crude medical treatment and sometimes inhumane care that was dished out in many of these total institutions. A feature of visiting these places was that regardless of what troubles brought people there, people started to behave in much the same way. I would very much commend you to read Goffman's Asylums for an early study of life within such institutions.
The motion picture screen opens the door to sights you've never seen before. Shock corridor. The medical jungle doctors don't talk about. A labyrinth of twisted detours that both sexes stumble along. Case history number 1. Johnny B., brilliant newspaper reporter, suffering from hallucinations that his sweetheart is his sister.
Johnny.
Don't ever do that! Don't you ever kiss me like that again!
What's the matter? What is it, Johnny? Tell me!
You're exciting the other patients by shouting!
Johnny! Johnny, you mean no!
Diagnosis, erotic dementia.
Forgive me for saying it, Miss Barrett, but there's something very strange about this case.
Case history number 2. Kathy B. Stripteaser, young, intelligent, beautiful.
Do you think I like singing in that sewer with a hot light on my navel? I'm doing it because it pays more than shorthand or clerking or typing.
I know that.
Kathy's torrid performances, however, reveal her avid reaction to the excitement of male audiences. Diagnosis, manic sensualist. Case history number 3. Robert T., the lone Negro student who stepped out of a white university into a straitjacket.
Run, Smith, run! Run, run, run!
Diagnosis, acute schizophrenia.
Don't you dare strike me. I'm pregnant.
Shock corridor, the incredibly realistic story that reveals the strange intrigues, the criminal impulses, the obsessions that explode into violence.
Because I want her and nobody's gonna keep us back! I want her!
Then there was a day Johnny was trapped in the ward of love-maddened women.
He's mine. He's mine. He's mine.
Sadly, perhaps, only one of these diagnostic labels persists, and it characterizes the individual as dangerous. In the not-too-distant past, all many people knew of mental illness and treatment was what they saw at the movies, and this certainly shaped attitudes and fears. There are some wonderful exceptions that portray positive images of mental illness or mental health problems, but fear continues to sell. What seems to me to be a late 20th century phenomena is the capacity to witness quite publicly celebrities losing the plot or outing themselves as having a mental illness. This would have been outrageous in times gone by. Today we are much more likely to talk about mental illness, or at least other people's manifestations of presumed illness. I suspect few media-savvy people couldn't rattle off the names of 10 or more celebrities who may have been mentally ill, or certainly appear to be behaving more outrageously than is merely rock and roll. We need to also remind ourselves that mental illness is not a homogeneous entity. Stigma is based on a stereotype, the attribution of particular negative features based on a single characteristic. Mental illness, disorder, or mental health problems refer to an extremely heterogeneous group of problems and experiences. Some of these experiences perhaps are less stigmatizing than others. Who hasn't been depressed? The internet is replete with lists of famous people who have apparently battled the black dog. Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon. Maybe that's why. Woody Allen, Hans Christian Andersen. It seems every second famous novelist and every philosopher, Foucault, Nietzsche, musicians, sports people, artists, politicians. Oprah claimed that depression made her eat 30 pounds of mac and cheese. And it would seem up to 25% of us mere mortals also will have a major depressive episode at some time. Apparently 10% of people in North America are on an antidepressant drug at any one time. And in Australia, over 12 million prescriptions for antidepressants are written every year. We should not make light of the very real burden of depression and attendant problems, but it would seem that being depressed just does not carry the same stigma it once did. The high prevalence problems that we talked about previously, alcoholism, anxiety disorders and depression, don't, in my view, carry the same shame they once did in many circles. Although large-scale surveys do suggest that people are wary about disclosing a history of any mental health problems, particularly to prospective employers, and often for good reason. That said, the concerted campaigns to get people talking about their feelings seems to work, and people more than at any time in history are seeking help for these high prevalence problems. The obvious thing is that depressed people, however, do tend to get better, regardless of treatment, quite frequently. The low prevalence problems, however, are much more inexplicable. Bipolar seems to be overdiagnosed nowadays with the extension of bipolar 2, and quite the trendy thing. And of course people with bipolar can be incredibly productive. Wikipedia lists vast numbers of people diagnosed with bipolar. Carrie Fisher, Stephen Fry, Mel Gibson, Spike Milligan, and quite possibly our own Florence Nightingale, to name a few. The manic energy and diminished need for sleep makes people fun to be around and feeds productivity, up until a point. Hence many politicians and artists might benefit from bipolar, although the posthumous diagnosis of historical figures is fraught with difficulty. Psychosis, however, which of course can accompany extreme mood states but is perhaps best associated with the various syndromes we call the schizophrenias, has much less positive connotations. There are no huge lists of famous people diagnosed with schizophrenia. John Nash, the Nobel laureate mathematician and the subject of the film A Beautiful Mind, is a rare exception. Psychosis and the schizophrenias are the butt of jokes, irrational scaremongering and fear. Public attitudes towards the schizophrenias has been more studied than any other aspect of stigma and discrimination to do with mental health and illness. There is considerable evidence that the stigma associated with psychosis is tenacious. Studies in New Zealand, Ireland and the UK exploring discrimination and stigma directly consistently find that at least 75% of people are reticent about disclosing mental health problems to others and report examples of discrimination, particularly in employment and with family members. Disturbingly, people internalize stigma and may choose not to avail of opportunities or live life fully because they believe they will be discriminated against, or because they come to believe some of the negative messages, that they are weak, out of control, and so forth. In Australia, the recently released National Survey of People Living with Psychosis paints a fairly positive picture of improvements in the care and social positions of those diagnosed with psychotic illness since the first survey in 1997 to 1998. Since that time, there has been a 90% increase in funding for services, and the services and quality of care does appear to have improved. However, some results relating to stigma and discrimination continue to be disturbing. Note that these are reports from people themselves. Often the research around stigma and discrimination looks at the attitudes of the general public in response to case vignettes. Until fairly recently, the psychiatric or medical approach to reducing stigma has been to emphasize that mental illness is just like any other kind of illness, and that public education to this effect, to put out there an understanding of mental distress as a medical problem, will improve people's attitudes. In these Canadian advertisements, mental illness is analogous to, but not the same as mental illness, or medical illness. I think the subtle difference is often lost on some people, including health professionals. For example, Stephen Hyman, director of the National Institute of Mental Health, is quoted as saying, "These are real illnesses of a real origin, the brain, just like the coronary artery disease is a disease of a real organ, the heart. Another prognostically pessimistic expert states, mental illness is not a behavioural choice and is rooted in a person's biochemical foundation. Mental illness is a chronic disease just like diabetes. And a respected child psychiatrist states, it's hard to believe that until 20 years ago we still believed that inadequate parenting and bad childhood traumas were the cause of psychiatric illness in children. And in fact, even though we know better today, that antiquated way of thinking is still out there, so that people who wouldn't dream of blaming parents for other types of diseases like their child's diabetes or asthma still embrace the notion that somehow absent fathers, working mothers, over-permissive parents are the cause of psychiatric illness in children. And the only way we can change that is through more public awareness. I mean, essentially, these are no-fault brain disorders. The impact of this promotion of the orthodoxy that mental illness is like any other has been studied. Reed and others in 2006 published a review of studies exploring the impact. They concluded that the public tended to actually prefer psychosocial explanations. Indeed, consistent with this, a 1997 survey of over 2,000 Australians found that 94% thought the most likely cause of schizophrenia was the day-to-day problems such as stress, family arguments, difficulties at work or financial difficulties. Problems from childhood, such as being badly treated or abused, losing one or both parents when young, or coming from a broken home, were rated as likely to cause problems by 88.5% of people. Only 59% endorsed inherited or genetic explanations. Now, for myself, I think these are fairly reasonable ideas, but much attitudinal research would put these respondents in the lacking insight camp, whereas if they had said that schizophrenia was a lifelong brain disease characterized by a chemical imbalance, they would be said to have a greater understanding of schizophrenia, even though these are speculative ideas, if not entirely wrong. What has been found is that if people believe that mental problems are best construed as an illness like others, they are more likely to seek help from a health professional. This kind of makes sense. You know, if it's perceived as a health problem, then the obvious place to seek help would be from health professionals. However, the extent to which they hold such beliefs are directly related to fear, a desire for distance, and people are more likely to be perceived as unpredictable and dangerous. Holding predominantly biomedical views about mental illness, of course, absolves the individual of moral accountability for their actions that might arise from being ill. It also absolves parents and perpetrators of abuse from responsibility for the person's the consequences, mental consequences of their behaviour. But it does reinforce that people have little control over their behaviour, which may in turn contribute to fear. It is beyond the scope of this lecture to address solutions to this problem. Suffice to say that there is a limit to the extent that addressing problems of knowledge through mental health literacy can address problems of attitudes and behaviour. Indeed, our very own beliefs as professionals may contribute to the problem at times. And that's where I'd like to leave the lecture today. Many people diagnosed with mental health problems report that the stigma associated with it, that is, people's attitudes and behaviour towards them, is harder to deal with than the initial problems they sought help for. So this is a very serious problem, one which is made more problematic because the very way we conceive of mental health problems, however reasonable or not, will have a large bearing on how stigma is manifested. As health professionals, I hope you will bear this in mind and maintain a critical awareness of this relationship as you become inculcated into your professional roles. Thank you.